I'm Jonah's 34 male. I live in a small, cozy house in Helena, Montana with my wife Natalie and our daughter Ella. I run a small construction company and my life is simple, quiet, and filled with the kind of warmth I never knew as a child. But just before last Thanksgiving, a single text message from an unknown number arrived with a chilling warning, dragging me back to my family's sprawling mansion and into a real-life nightmare that would shatter everything I thought I knew. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. From the outside looking in, my life probably seems picture perfect. I have a cozy home where the scent of brewing coffee mixes with the sound of my daughter's laughter. My wife, Natalie, is the center of my universe, a beacon of light who taught me what love really felt like. Our daughter, Ella, is 7, and she is the physical embodiment of a joy I never believed I was entitled to. These are the moments I hold on to, the simple, quiet ones that form the foundation of the life I built for myself, far away from the one I was born into. But sometimes, even in the middle of a perfect morning, a cold spot forms in my chest. It's a hollow feeling, a reminder of the deep cracks hidden beneath the smooth surface of my life. I grew up a few hours away in Bozeman in a world that felt like a different country. My family, the Hales, were what people called local aristocracy. The name carried a certain weight, a mix of respect and distance that always made me uncomfortable. My father, Charles Hale, was the architect of this empire, the founder of Hale Holdings, one of the biggest real estate conglomerates in Montana. He was a tall, imposing figure, always dressed in dark suits with a voice that sounded like shifting stones. He never showed emotion, believing it was a sign of weakness. My mother, Lorraine, was the definition of cold elegance. Her hair was always perfectly coiffed, her dresses immaculate, but her eyes held the same chill as the stone walls of our mansion. They were a powerful duo, running their business, their social lives, and their children with the precision of a well-oiled machine. The place I grew up in, the Bridger Ridge Mansion, was a magnificent graystone structure with towering windows and gardens so perfectly manicured they looked fake. But inside, the house was devoid of warmth. It wasn't the Montana cold that seeped into your bones. It was the emotional frost of a home where perfection was the only acceptable standard. Reputation is everything, my father would declare at our sterile family dinners, and my mother would nod in agreement as if it were scripture. My younger brother, Case, was the complete opposite of me. He was 5 years my junior and a force of nature. If I was the dutiful, obedient son who always colored inside the lines, Case was a wildfire refusing to be contained. He was impulsive, defiant, and constantly testing the boundaries our parents had erected around us. I have vivid memories of our childhood, me sitting at a desk piled high with books, while Case was sneaking out to climb the hills behind the estate or racing down the lane on a bicycle he'd borrowed from a neighbor. "You're like a robot, Jonas," he'd tease, his eyes sparkling with a mischief I secretly envied. But beneath that playful exterior, I knew he was hurting. It was the deep, unacknowledged pain of a child raised in a house where expectations stood in for affection. Our parents were rarely present. Their lives were a whirlwind of board meetings, extravagant parties, and strategic planning sessions to expand their empire. Case and I learned to raise ourselves, each coping in our own way. I chose the path of least resistance, becoming the model son they paraded at social functions. I attended the right schools, earned top grades, and seamlessly entered the world of business they had mapped out for me. Case chose rebellion. He dropped out of school, got involved in risky investments with questionable people, and quickly found himself buried in debt. "You need to be an example for your brother," my father would tell me, his tone heavy with disappointment in his younger son. I'd nod obediently, but every time I looked at Case, I saw him drifting further and further away, a ship lost at sea without an anchor. The chasm between us widened with each passing year. Case felt the constant weight of comparison, forever cast as the wayward son in the shadow of the perfect heir. I remember one excruciatingly rare family dinner where he finally snapped. He slammed his fist on the table, his face red with fury. "He's just your puppet," he snarled, pointing at me. "But I'm the future of this family." My mother didn't even flinch, simply taking a delicate sip of her wine. My father fixed Case with a stare so cold it could freeze fire. "No, Case," he said, his voice flat. "You are just a disappointment." The final fracture occurred when I was 29. Case was arrested for financial fraud. He had embezzled a significant amount of money from the company where he worked, and the scandal erupted across Bozeman. The newspapers had a field day, branding him the Hale family traitor. For my parents, it was an unforgivable stain on their pristine reputation. "This house no longer has a son by that name," my father announced, his voice absolute and unwavering. I tried to help. I hired the best lawyer I could find, but Case refused to see me. The last time we spoke was through the thick glass partition in the prison visiting room. His eyes were empty. "Go home, Jonas," he said, his voice a hollow echo. "Don't waste your time on me." Then he hung up the phone and walked away, cutting off all contact. After that, I couldn't stay in Bozeman. The suffocating atmosphere of Bridger Ridge, the judgmental glares from our social circle, and the ghosts of a family that had never really been one were too much to bear. I moved to Helena, started my own life, and met Natalie. She was the sunshine that broke through my lifelong winter. She knew how to make me laugh, and she never pushed me to talk about the past I was so desperate to escape. The birth of Ella was a revelation, a pure, uncomplicated love that healed parts of me I didn't know were broken. I did my best to bury everything associated with the Hale name, but the past has a way of haunting you. On long, quiet nights with snow falling outside my window, I would still dream of that cold, silent mansion. The only person in that entire house who ever showed me genuine warmth was Agnes Porter, our family's housekeeper. She had been with us since Case and I were born, a steady presence in a world of absence. She was the one who wiped away my tears and told Case bedtime stories to chase away his fears. "Sometimes people aren't cruel, Jonas," she told me once when I was 15, after my father had berated me for a less-than-perfect report card. "They're just too busy to remember how to love." Her words have stayed with me ever since. Now, as Thanksgiving approaches again, that old anxiety returns. My parents will call, as they always do, insisting I come home for the traditional family dinner. Natalie loves the idea, believing in the importance of family, unaware of the cold reality of mine. But for me, every step toward those iron gates is a step back into a past I've fought so hard to leave behind. A storm is brewing, and I'm terrified that when it finally hits, this perfect picture I've built for myself is going to shatter into a million pieces. The morning of Thanksgiving arrived in Helena under a heavy blanket of fresh snow. The world outside was hushed and white. Inside our home, however, it was a flurry of warmth and activity. Natalie was in the kitchen, humming an old carol as she tied festive red ribbons around gift boxes filled with homemade cookies. Ella sat on the living room floor, her tongue sticking out in concentration as she added the final touches to a drawing of a reindeer with a very shiny nose. She held it up for my approval, her smile so bright it could have melted all the snow in Montana. "Look, Daddy, I finished." I knelt beside her, praising her masterpiece, but my mind was miles away, in a place I dreaded returning to. The annual trip to Bridger Ridge was an obligation I couldn't escape. My father had called weeks ago, his voice as formal and cold as ever. "Jonas, your presence is expected, it's tradition." I didn't put up a fight, I never did. It was easier to endure a few hours of strained silence than to deal with the fallout of defying him. Yet the mere thought of walking through those massive front doors made my chest constrict, as if an invisible band was tightening around my lungs. As I was loading our bags into the car, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out to see a message from an unknown number. The text was short, blunt, and deeply unsettling. "Don't go home today, it's dangerous." I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the words. Who could have sent this? Was it a prank? A wrong number? My logical mind told me to dismiss it, to delete it and move on. I shoved the phone back into my pocket, but the message had already planted a seed of dread. Those few words were like a splinter under the skin, a small but persistent source of pain. We set off on the road to Bozeman. Natalie was beside me, double-checking her gift list, while Ella was happily chattering in the back seat, clutching her reindeer drawing. I tried to focus on the road, on the gentle rhythm of the windshield wipers sweeping away the falling snow. I turned on the radio, hoping to drown out the uneasy thoughts swirling in my head, but the signal was weak, cutting in and out with a weather report warning of a snowstorm gathering over the mountains nearby. Bridger Ridge. The sky was a uniform, heavy gray, pressing down on the landscape. I couldn't shake the warning, "It's dangerous." It played on a loop in my mind. Against my better judgment, I pulled out my phone and tried calling the number. It rang and rang before going to a generic voicemail. My hands felt cold and clammy on the steering wheel, a stark contrast to the warm air blasting from the car's vents. Natalie noticed my agitation. She placed a comforting hand on my arm. "What's on your mind? You seem a million miles away." I forced a smile, trying to appear casual. "Just thinking about work stuff, it's nothing." But it was a lie, and I think she knew it. The fear was a tangible thing, a third passenger in the car with us. As we got closer to Bozeman, about halfway through our journey, I decided to try the number one last time. This time, to my surprise, someone answered. The connection was terrible, crackling with static, but I could make out a voice. It was faint, trembling, and achingly familiar. It was Agnes, our family's housekeeper, the woman who had practically raised my brother and me. Her voice, which I remembered as a source of steadfast warmth, now sounded thin and brittle like old parchment. "Jonas, is that you?" she whispered, her words broken by static. "Don't come to the house, please, don't come today." My blood ran cold. "Agnes, what's wrong? What's happening?" Her words came in choppy fragments, battling the poor signal. Your brother, Case, he's out of prison. He's here, Jonas, he's at the house. My heart hammered against my ribs. Case, out of prison and at Bridger Ridge. The pieces were starting to click into place, forming a picture I didn't want to see. The house, it's so tense, Agnes continued, her voice choked with fear. Your father is trying to pretend everything is normal, your mother is avoiding him, but Case, he's different. Colder, I have a terrible feeling, Jonas, just stay away. And then the line went dead. The call ended, leaving me in a profound and terrifying silence. I stared at the phone in my hand, my pulse roaring in my ears. Case was back. The anonymous warning, Agnes's terrified call, it all pointed to something awful brewing at the mansion. The air in the car suddenly felt thick and suffocating. Natalie was looking at me, her eyes wide with alarm. Jonas, who was that? What is going on? I couldn't answer her right away. My mouth was dry, my thoughts a chaotic mess. Case, the brother who had disowned me, who had been a ghost for years, was back. And Agnes, the most level-headed person I knew, was terrified of him. That fact alone sent a shiver down my spine. I pulled the car over to the side of the snowy road, the tires crunching loudly in the sudden stillness. I'm taking you and Ella to your parents' place in Big Sky, I said, my voice coming out strained and tight. I need to go to Bridger Ridge by myself. Natalie's face went pale. What are you talking about? You're scaring me, Jonas. In the backseat, Ella had stopped her chatter and was looking at us with wide, confused eyes. I tried to give her a reassuring smile, but it felt as fragile as thin ice. It's okay, sweetie. Daddy just has to take care of something. It was far from okay. I was driving headfirst into a storm and I couldn't let my family be caught in it. I turned the car around and headed toward Big Sky. Natalie fell silent, but her hand rested on my leg, a silent plea for me to be careful. After dropping them off with a promise to explain everything later, Natalie pulled me into a tight hug. Please be safe, she whispered into my coat. I just nodded, unable to speak around the lump forming in my throat. The drive to Bozeman alone was a blur. The world seemed to shrink to just the narrow tunnel of my headlights cutting through the swirling snow. The radio was now issuing a full-blown blizzard warning, but the storm outside was nothing compared to the one raging inside me. Agnes's fearful voice echoed in my head, a constant refrain of "Don't come." Finally, through the thick curtain of snow, the imposing iron gates of Bridger Ridge came into view. They stood like sentinels guarding a forgotten kingdom, cold and uninviting. I stopped the car just outside, the engine idling softly. Through the windshield, I could see the mansion. Its windows were aglow with golden light, making it look warm and welcoming, a cruel illusion against the backdrop of the brewing storm and the dread churning in my gut. This wasn't just a house. It was a tomb of memories, and I was about to step back inside. I sat in my car for what felt like an eternity, the engine's low hum the only sound besides the wind whistling through the pines. My hands were clamped onto the steering wheel, knuckles white, as if letting go would mean being swept away by the storm of memories swirling around me. The mansion stood before me, its lights flickering in the snowy twilight like the slow, steady breathing of a ping beast. I closed my eyes, but the images came flooding back, sharp and relentless. I saw Case and me as kids, our laughter echoing across the hills as we built snow forts in the winter and chased fireflies in the summer. Case, always the fearless leader with his wild ideas and infectious grin. One day we'll get out of here, Jonas, he'd said to me once, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. Just you and me will be free. I had laughed along with him, but a part of me always knew I was too much of a coward to ever break free. I was the responsible one, the one molded to uphold the Hale family name. But Case was different. As he got older, he strayed further from the path our parents had paved. While I dedicated myself to my studies, desperate for a crumb of our father's approval, Case found his own circle, a group of people our father dismissed as delinquents. He became reckless, always looking for trouble. With every stern lecture from our father, Case's defiant smirk only grew wider. He just wants me to be a carbon copy of you, he confessed to me late one night in the cavernous kitchen. I wanted to tell him that I wasn't his rival, that I was on his side, but the words wouldn't come. I was always silent. Things escalated when Case was 19. He'd got himself into a serious debt with some dangerous people in town. I'll never forget the night they showed up at Bridger Ridge, their leather jackets and menacing glares a stark contrast to our pristine world. They stood at the gates demanding their money. Our father met them with his usual icy resolve. The Hales do not pay the debts of fools, he declared, his voice cutting through the cold night air. They left, but not before issuing a chilling threat. Case had disappeared that night, leaving our parents and me to face the consequences. I saw my father in his study, his fists clenched, his face a mask of cold fury. That boy is a disgrace, he seethed. For the first and only time, I saw my mother shed a tear, though she wiped it away so quickly it might have been a trick of the light. The final, irrevocable break came with his arrest for embezzlement. Our parents cut him out of their lives as cleanly as a surgeon's scalpel, disowning him without a second thought. My last memory of him was his retreating back in the cold, gray hallway of the prison. He had taken the last vestiges of our shared childhood with him, leaving me alone in the dark. A sudden, jarring noise pulled me back to the present. A black SUV came roaring down the long driveway from the mansion, its tires skidding on the icy ground as it sped through the gates. It flew past my car and disappeared into the snow-swept darkness. My heart leaped into my throat. That vehicle didn't belong to my family. I knew every car my parents owned. A cold dread began to creep up my spine. Who was in that SUV, and why were they in such a hurry to leave? Something was terribly wrong. Every instinct was screaming at me to turn the car around and drive away, but I couldn't. I had to know what was happening inside that house. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, I put the car in drive and rolled slowly through the now open gates. The headlights swept across the grounds, revealing the rows of pine trees standing like silent, snow-dusted sentinels. The air was unnervingly still. I called out for the family's two security guards, John and Carter, but my voice was swallowed by the wind. There was no answer. I parked at the base of the grand stone steps and killed the engine, plunging myself into a heavy, oppressive silence. My own heartbeat sounded like a drum in my ears. As I stepped out of the car, a strange, metallic scent hit me, pungent and disturbingly familiar. It grew stronger as I approached the entrance. Then I saw them. John and Carter were slumped near the doorway, their dark uniforms stained with even darker patches of blood that were beginning to freeze on the stone. Their firearms were scattered nearby, as if they never even had a chance to draw them. My legs nearly gave out from under me. I staggered backward, my hand finding the massive oak door for support. It swung open under my touch with an ominous creak. "Dad, Mom, Agnes," I called out, my voice a weak whisper. The main hall was dark, illuminated only by a faint, sickly glow emanating from the dining room. I moved toward the light, my feet feeling like they were encased in lead. The scene that awaited me was one of pure carnage. The long, formal dining table, the site of so many cold and silent meals, was in complete chaos. Shards of broken wine glasses crunched under my feet, the spilled red wine indistinguishable from the streaks of blood that marred the floor. The white tablecloth was stained a horrific crimson and yanked sideways, a testament to a violent struggle. And then I saw my father. Charles Hale, the untouchable patriarch, was slumped at the head of the table. A dark stain spread across the chest of his tie. Lord Suit and his eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling with a look of vacant surprise. A few feet away, my mother was sprawled in her chair, her head lolling to one side, a blood-soaked napkin still clutched in her hand. Her face, always a mask of perfect composure, was now frozen in an expression of her final, agonizing moments. A guttural sound escaped my throat, a mix of a sob and a scream. My body was paralyzed, my mind refusing to process the horror before me. My eyes scanned the room, desperate for any sign of life, but found only more death. Near the kitchen entrance, two of the household maids lay motionless on the floor. One of them, Mary, was still holding her cell phone, her fingers locked on the screen as if her last act was a failed attempt to call for help. I stumbled back, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The overwhelming smell of blood and the bone-deep chill of the house were suffocating me. And then I heard it, a faint, weak moan coming from the direction of the grand staircase. Hope, as terrifying as it was, flickered within me. I followed the sound, my legs trembling uncontrollably. There, at the bottom of the stairs, was Agnes. She was lying in a heap, blood pooling from a wound on her shoulder, her breathing shallow and ragged. I rushed to her side, kneeling in the spreading pool of her blood. "Agnes, Agnes, can you hear me?" I grabbed her hand. It was as cold as ice. She tried to speak, but only a gurgle came from her lips. Her eyes, however, were wide with a desperate, urgent panic. She was trying to warn me. My gaze followed hers down to the floor, and my heart stopped. A trail of bloody footprints led away from where she lay, heading towards the back of the house and disappearing into the darkness. The black SUV. The footprints, the massacre. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, forming a monstrous image. Case, could he have done this? The thought was a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. I stood up, my legs shaking, my eyes fixed on the back door. The mansion was no longer a symbol of wealth and power. It was a tomb, and I was standing in its cold, dark heart. My hands trembled so violently I could barely hold my phone. It felt slick in my grip, coated in Agnes's warm, sticky blood. I fumbled to dial 911, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. When the dispatcher answered, my voice was a choked whisper, words torn from my throat. "There's been a murder," I managed to say, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. "At Bridger Ridge, my family, please send help, quickly." I don't remember the rest of the conversation. When I hung up, I sank back to the floor beside Agnes, pressing my hands against her shoulder in a desperate, futile attempt to stop the bleeding. "Hold on, Agnes," I pleaded, my voice cracking. "Help is on the way." Her eyes were frantic, but they seemed to be looking past me, into a distance I couldn't see, as if her spirit was already beginning to drift away. The wait felt like an eternity, suspended in the horrifying silence of the house. Then, the silence was shattered by the piercing wail of sirens growing steadily closer. The red and blue lights of police cruisers and ambulances sliced through the night, painting the snow-covered grounds in chaotic, pulsating colors. It felt like the nightmare was bleeding out from the house into the world outside. The front door burst open and the mansion was suddenly swarming with uniformed officers. Their movements were urgent, their voices sharp and commanding. An officer gently but firmly pulled me to my feet away from Agnes. "Sir, you need to step outside," he said, his tone professional but not unkind. He draped a thick blanket over my shoulders, but it did nothing to warm the profound internal chill that had settled deep in my bones. I stood numbly in the yard, watching as paramedics rushed into the house with stretchers and medical kits. Their shouts echoed from inside, a cacophony of urgent commands and medical jargon that sounded like a foreign language. They emerged moments later with Agnes. Her face was a deathly pale against the white of the stretcher, her breathing terrifyingly shallow. "She's in critical condition," I heard one of them say into a radio. "We need to transport immediately." I had the urge to run to her, to hold her hand, to tell her she wasn't alone. But my feet felt like they were bolted to the frozen ground. The police began to secure the scene, unfurling spools of bright yellow tape that cordoned off the entrance, a stark barrier between the living and the dead. The blood of the two guards had already started to freeze on the stone steps, a gruesome welcome mat to the House of Horrors. A stern-faced, middle-aged detective approached me and asked me to recount what had happened. I sat on a cold stone bench, the blanket forgotten on the ground beside me, and told him everything. My voice was hollow and detached, as if I were narrating someone else. As a story, I told him about the cryptic text message, with its stark two-word warning, "It's dangerous." I told him about my fragmented, terrifying phone call with Agnes, her panicked voice warning me that my brother Case was at the house. And I told him about the mysterious black SUV that had sped away from the mansion just before I arrived, vanishing into the blizzard like a phantom. The detective listened intently, taking meticulous notes, his sharp eyes never leaving my face. I could feel him sizing me up, evaluating my story, trying to determine where I fit into this horrific puzzle. Soon the forensic teams arrived, their white vans pulling up the long driveway. They moved with a quiet, detached professionalism, their faces grim but resolute. They were accustomed to scenes of death and they went about their work with methodical precision. I overheard one of them speaking to the detective. "We have 6 victims, sir, all deceased except for the elderly woman who was transported. 6 victims." The words hit me like a physical blow. My father, the indomitable Charles Hale. My mother, the ever-poised Lorraine. John and Carter, the guards whose faces I'd known since I was a boy. And Mary and Clara, the 2 young maids, innocent bystanders caught in a storm that wasn't their own. A raw, guttural sob escaped my lips, but I had no tears left to cry. The search of the crime scene began, and it wasn't long before they found something that made my blood turn to ice. A young officer with intense, piercing eyes approached the lead detective, holding a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside, 2 objects glinted under the beam of his flashlight, a handgun and a simple metal bracelet. My breath caught in my throat. It was the bracelet I had given Case for his 18th birthday. I remembered the day clearly. He had laughed, slipped it on his wrist, and said, "You actually have good taste, Jonas." Now that same bracelet, a symbol of a time when we were still brothers, was sitting in an evidence bag smeared with blood. "The serial number on this firearm is registered to a Case Hale," the young officer stated, his voice flat and even. "We're running it through the system to confirm. Do you know anything about this, sir?" I felt as if all the air had been sucked out of my lungs. Case, his gun, his bracelet. "No," I whispered, the word barely audible. "It can't be him. Case wouldn't, he couldn't do this." But even as I said it, the words sounded weak and hollow, a desperate attempt to convince myself more than the officer. He didn't respond, but his gaze was heavy with skepticism. He didn't believe me, and a horrifying part of me wasn't sure I believed myself. Outside the yellow tape, the snow continued to fall, a soft, silent shroud that was slowly erasing the tire tracks of the black SUV, burying the evidence as if it had never been there at all. My mind was a chaotic whirlwind of denial and dawning horror. The bloody footprints, the gun, the bracelet, every piece of evidence was a finger pointing directly at my brother. I thought of the Case I knew as a boy, the one with the bright, mischievous smile who used to chase me through the fields behind the mansion. He had made mistakes, terrible ones, but this, the cold-blooded murder of our entire family. I shook my head, hot tears finally streaming down my face, freezing instantly in the frigid air. "It wasn't him," I mumbled to the empty night, my voice lost in the howling wind. but every fiber of logic, every piece of evidence screamed that it was. And the last shred of faith I had that case, my little brother, was still in there somewhere, was rapidly dissolving into the cold, unforgiving snow. I left the chaos of Bridger Ridge behind, my car cutting a solitary path through the snow-swept roads toward Bozeman Memorial Hospital. My mind was a blank slate scrubbed clean by shock. The only thought that propelled me forward was Agnes. She was the last link to my past, the only other person who had survived the massacre, and I couldn't bear the thought of losing her too. The hospital was a sterile white beacon in the stormy night. I walked through the automatic doors, my clothes still stained with drying blood, and asked a nurse at the front desk for Agnes's condition. "She's currently in surgery," the young nurse replied, her voice gentle but unable to hide the grim reality. "It's critical. Her chances are not high." The words were a physical blow, another layer of ice forming around my already frozen heart. I mumbled my thanks and collapsed into a hard plastic chair in the deserted waiting area. Hours crawled by. Each tick of the clock on the wall was a slow, agonizing drumbeat marking the passage of time in a world that had ceased to make sense. Sometime near dawn, the doors to the operating room swung open and a surgeon in green scrubs walked towards me. His face was etched with fatigue, but his eyes held a glimmer of hope. "She made it through," he said, his voice low and steady. "The next 24 hours are critical, but she's a fighter." Relief washed over me so intensely that my legs felt weak. I buried my face in my hands, tears of exhaustion and gratitude silently tracing paths through the grime on my cheeks. I practically lived at the hospital for the next few days, refusing to leave Agnes's side. The outside world continued to spin, but my universe had shrunk to the four walls of her hospital room. Late one afternoon, my phone, which I had forgotten existed, buzzed to life. It was Natalie. Her voice was a lifeline, warm and loving, but laced with an anxiety she was trying to hide. "Jonas, I'm so worried. What's happening over there?" I closed my eyes, leaning my head against the cool glass of the window. I couldn't tell her the truth, not yet. I couldn't let this nightmare touch her and Ella. "Everything's fine, honey," I lied, the words tasting bitter. "Just some family complications. I might have to stay for a few more days." I wanted to protect them from the darkness that had consumed the Hale family, to keep them safe in the light, at least for a little while longer. 3 days after the attack, Agnes woke up. I was dozing in the chair by her bed when I heard her stir. Her eyes fluttered open, weak but filled with the same fierce determination that had kept her alive. "Jonas," she rasped, her voice as thin as a thread. I grabbed her hand, my own tears welling up again. "You're safe now, Agnes, you're okay." But the profound pain in her eyes told me that neither of us would ever truly be okay again. Just then, two police officers entered the room. "We need to get a statement, Ms. Porter," the plainclothes detective said, his voice soft but firm. I stepped aside, my heart pounding in my chest, dreading what was to come. Agnes's voice was frail, barely a whisper, but her memory was sharp. She recounted the events of that night with horrifying clarity. Case had arrived for Thanksgiving dinner with a bottle of wine and a large manila envelope. The meal had been a tense, silent affair. Charles, my father, had tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, while Lorraine, my mother, pointedly ignored her younger son. Case had been quiet, but his eyes, Agnes said, were as cold as a winter sky. Then he had spoken. He told them that while he was in prison, the family lawyer, Harold Pritchard, had sent him a document at Charles's instruction, a newly drafted will that completely disinherited him. "Why?" Case had demanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and hurt. My father's reply had been typically brutal and swift. "Because you are no longer a part of this family." That was the final blow. According to Agnes, Case snapped. He shattered his wine glass against the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. Then came the real gunshots. Agnes saw my father slump forward, then Lorraine, who had tried to intervene, collapsed. A bullet struck Agnes in the shoulder and she fell to the floor, the world fading to black. When she regained consciousness, Case was gone. Her testimony was a death knell for the last flicker of hope I had clung to. It fit the evidence perfectly, the shattered glass, the location of the bodies, and the blood-stained bracelet found at the scene. The police acted quickly. A statewide manhunt was launched for Case Hale. His face was plastered across every news channel, his name now synonymous with armed and dangerous. The press descended on the story like vultures, spinning a sensational tale of the disowned heir's bloody revenge. I couldn't watch it. The man on the screen was a stranger, a monster who wore my brother's face. A week after the massacre, the funeral for my parents was held. The church was filled with distant relatives and business associates, their faces masks of feigned solemnity. It was a grand, impersonal affair steeped in ritual but utterly devoid of genuine grief. No one cried. Natalie and Ella had come, and my daughter's innocent question, "Daddy, where did Grandpa and Grandma go?" pierced my heart more than any eulogy could. Afterward, I met with Harold Pritchard. He sat behind his large mahogany desk, his expression somber. "Jonas," he began, "we need to discuss the will." He slid a sealed envelope across the desk. My parents had left everything to me: the mansion, the shares in Hale Holdings, the vast fortune. Case's name was not mentioned once. "This was signed a week before Thanksgiving," Pritchard added, "while Case was still incarcerated." So it was true. My parents had made their final, cruelest move from beyond the grave, and it had pushed their son over the edge. The immense inheritance felt less like a gift and more like a curse, the price of my family's destruction. 3 weeks after that horrific night, the call I had been both dreading and anticipating finally came. A police detective, his voice devoid of emotion, informed me they had found the black SUV. It had been abandoned in a remote forest near the Idaho border. Inside, they found Case's fingerprints, blood samples that matched the crime scene, and something that made my breath catch in my throat: an old, faded photograph of Case and me as children, smiling without a care in the world on a sunny day at Bridger Ridge. The photo, once a cherished memory, was now a piece of evidence, tainted by the blood and violence that had torn our family apart. That same evening, Case was apprehended. He was found at a desolate gas station 40 miles from where the SUV was discovered. He was exhausted, his clothes were ragged, and he offered no resistance. The news exploded. I watched on a hotel television as my brother, handcuffed and surrounded by a mob of reporters, was led into the police station. His eyes, captured in the harsh glare of the camera flashes, were not filled with the defiance or rage I had expected. They were simply empty, the hollowed-out eyes of a man who had already lost everything that mattered. I felt a choking sensation, as if the handcuffs were around my own wrists, dragging me into the same darkness that had consumed him. The trial began 2 months later and became the biggest media event in Montana. The courtroom was packed every day, a theater for the public's morbid curiosity. I sat in the back, trying to make myself invisible to escape the prying lenses and whispered speculations. Agnes, still frail but resolute, was the prosecution's star witness. She walked to the stand with a slow, deliberate gait, her gaze fixed forward. Her testimony was devastating. In a clear, unwavering voice, she recounted Case's chilling transformation at the dinner table, the cold fury in his eyes as he drew the gun. Each word was a nail in his coffin, methodically sealing his fate. Throughout the proceedings, Case sat at the defendant's table like a stone statue. He was gaunt, his hair unkempt, his eyes sunken into his skull. He never looked at me, never looked at Agnes, never looked at anyone. He remained silent, a ghost haunting his own trial. He spoke only once when the prosecutor asked him if he had anything to say. He looked at the judge, his voice calm but infused with a profound, unreachable pain. "I lost everything a long time ago." The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. The judge's pen scratching against paper was the only sound as he signed the verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was swift and absolute: life in prison with no possibility of parole. The sharp rap of the judge's gavel sounded as final as the gunshots on that Thanksgiving night. I sat frozen in my seat, a strange numbness spreading through me. I didn't know who I was mourning more: my parents, who had died so violently, or my brother, who was now condemned to a living death. He was led away in chains, the boy who used to be the light of my childhood, now just another prisoner swallowed by the system. A week later, I drove to Deer Lodge State Prison. I needed to see him one last time. I don't know what I was hoping for: an explanation, an apology, maybe just a flicker of the brother I once knew. The prison was a cold, imposing fortress of concrete and steel, smelling of disinfectant and despair. I sat in the visitor's room, a thick pane of glass separating me from the other side, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm against my ribs. When Case walked in, I barely recognized him. He was thinner, his face gaunt, but his eyes held a disturbing calmness, the unnerving peace of a man who has accepted his damnation. We sat facing each other, a universe of pain and betrayal between us. I struggled to find my voice. "Case, why?" I finally managed to ask, the word feeling small and inadequate. A faint, tired smile touched his lips. It wasn't a smirk of defiance, but a smile of pure exhaustion. "You wouldn't understand, Jonas," he said, his voice a low whisper that barely carried through the speaker. He leaned closer to the glass. "Everything they left you, all that wealth, that power, that's what killed them." His words were a riddle, a final, sharp twist of the knife. I wanted to press him, to demand he explain what he meant, but I could see in his clouded eyes that he had retreated to a place I could never follow. As the guards came to escort him away, he turned and gave me one last look. It wasn't the look of a monster or a murderer. It was the look of a man utterly and completely broken, a man who had lost his family, his freedom, and his soul. I stumbled out of the prison into the falling snow. The towering walls of the prison faded in my rearview mirror, but Case's cryptic words echoed in my mind, a curse I couldn't escape. I drove without direction, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the relentless snow, realizing that while Case was locked behind iron bars, I was now a prisoner of my own grief, haunted by questions that would never be answered. I returned to my small, quiet house in Helena, but it was no long. A home, it was a silent, empty space, a tomb for a life that had been stolen from me. Natalie and Ella were gone. They had retreated to her parents' house in Big Sky, seeking refuge from the relentless media circus that had engulfed our lives. The reporters were like a pack of wolves, constantly at our door, their cameras flashing, their questions intrusive and cruel. I didn't blame Natalie for leaving. I wanted them to be safe, to be shielded from the darkness that now clung to the Hale name. But their absence was a physical ache, a constant reminder of the peace I had lost. I became a recluse. I locked the doors, silenced my phone, and shut out the world. The press called constantly, dangling lucrative offers for exclusive interviews, eager for the last Hale heir to tell his tragic story. I refused them all. My family's pain was not a commodity to be sold for ratings. My only connection to the outside world was my regular visits to Agnes. She had been moved to a long-term care facility, and while her body was healing, I could see a deep, unassailable sadness in her eyes. She carried the same invisible wounds that I did. As stipulated in the will, my parents' vast fortune was transferred to my name. The wealth, the power, the reputation they had worshipped, it was all mine now. But it felt like a lead weight on my soul, a constant, crushing burden. I wanted no part of it. I sold off the majority of my shares in Hale Holdings, keeping only enough to satisfy the will's condition that I maintain the company's operations. The millions of dollars from the sale, I donated to a foundation for orphaned and at-risk children across Montana. It wasn't about atonement. It was about trying to create something positive from the ruins of my family's legacy. 4 months after the massacre, the police officially released the Bridger Ridge mansion back to me. For weeks, I avoided it, but I knew I couldn't run from it forever. One cold, clear morning, I drove back to Bozeman and stood before the iron gates, staring at the stone beast that had been the backdrop to my entire life. Walking through the front door was the hardest thing I'd ever done. The house had been professionally cleaned, all the physical traces of the horror were gone, but the air was still thick with the memory of it, a cold, palpable presence that clung to the walls. I walked through the dining room, the epicenter of the nightmare. I could still see the faint outline of a bullet mark on the wall, a tiny, indelible scar. In my father's study, everything was exactly as he had left it. On his desk, I found a framed photograph lying face down. The glass was cracked. I picked it up and brushed away the dust. It was the same photo the police had found in Case's SUV, our family, years ago when we were all still smiling. The crack ran directly through my parents' faces, leaving Case and me untouched, two boys trapped in a shattered past. I left the photo on the desk, a broken monument to a broken family. I spent the next few weeks cleaning the mansion myself, sorting through a lifetime of possessions. It was a painful, cathartic process. I wasn't trying to erase the past, but to finally face it. In my father's journals, I found pages filled with business strategies and ambitions, but not a single word about love or family or the sons he never knew how to connect with. I realized our family hadn't been destroyed in a single night of violence. It had been eroding for years, worn down by unspoken resentments, unmet expectations, and a profound lack of love. One day I stood on the porch, watching the snow fall, and for the first time I felt a sense of peace. The mansion was no longer a monster. It was just a house where I had grown up, where I had been loved in a flawed way, and where I had lost everything. Eventually, I returned to Helena, and so did Natalie and Ella. They came back not to the man I was, but to the man I was becoming. Our house was filled with life again. The pain was still there, a dull ache beneath the surface, but it was now interwoven with the simple joys of everyday life. Ella's laughter, Natalie's gentle touch, the warmth of a shared meal. They were my anchors in a stormy sea. Agnes passed away peacefully in her sleep a year later. I held her hand, knowing she was the last piece of my old life, a symbol of the unconditional love my family had been so desperately lacking. She once told me, every person leaves two legacies, Jonah's, one in a bank vault and one in the hearts of others. I chose to honor the latter. I kept the Bridger Ridge mansion but left it empty, a silent memorial on a lonely hill. I started volunteering, speaking to troubled teenagers, kids who, like Case, were teetering on the edge. I shared my brother's story not as a condemnation but as a cautionary tale. I couldn't save Case, but perhaps I could prevent another family from suffering the same fate. Forgiveness came slowly, not for Case or my parents, but for myself. I forgave myself for my silence, for not being strong enough to bridge the distances that ultimately consumed us all. I stood one morning in my own front yard, the cold Montana air on my face, and knew the storm inside me had finally passed. The cycle of pain was broken. I would carry the scars forever, but they would no longer define me. I was ready to live again, not by forgetting the past, but by honoring the lessons it had taught me.